You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this is episode number 55. Happy Feast of St. Andrew the Apostle, everybody. Before I introduce my very special guest this evening, just a word about the official sponsor of the Holy Smokes podcast, and that is Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. For the best service and finest cigars, I encourage everybody to go and check out their Facebook page at facebook.com/Havana Palace. Peruse their selection, maybe just drop the owner, Caesar, and his son Eli a message. Just ask how they're doing. Family owned and operated, wonderful shop. They treat all their customers like family, myself included. So I just wanted to give a big shout out to Havana Palace. And so for this evening, I have Gary Michuta on as my very special esteemed guest. Gary, how are you this evening, my friend?
I'm doing great. Doing great. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So we're going to talk about a new book that you've released, Revolt Against Reality. But before we do that, maybe I have some viewers that aren't familiar with you and your work. So why don't you, first of all, tell me a little bit about yourself. What was your faith life like growing up? And how did you ultimately get to the point to where you are today? You're so heavily involved in apologetics. You have a YouTube show, Apocrypha Apocalypse with William Albrëcht. You also have your own show on Virgin Most Powerful Radio, Hands on Apologetics. So why don't you talk us through a little bit of that before we jump into the topic tonight?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. Well, I was born pagan, was baptized, became Catholic. So I'm a cradle Catholic, always been Catholic, and had great parents that raised me in the faith. And in the 1980s, a lot of my friends were being pulled out of the church by Protestant fundamentalists. And actually, I had a somewhat decent understanding of the faith, but I was more into philosophy. For some reason, I was just enamored by studying philosophy and so on. So leaving high school into college, I ran into some anti-Catholics, and I battled with them, basically just picking at their logic and things like that, but didn't really engage in my faith. I always thought of it as a kind of esoteric pocket that, it's something for priests to study, but, no one really knows the deep depths of it. And, God's providence, it's funny, Dustin, my mother used to always tell me, if you want to have friends, never talk about politics and religion. So here I am talking about religion and with this book, a little bit of politics too.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I get my first full-time job out of college, and God puts me in the same section as a fundamentalist Baptist woman named Sue. She started challenging me on the faith, and we kind of went back and forth, and nothing really came of it. So we decided to study spiritual warfare, because that was something we could agree on, a common enemy.
Yeah.
And it's during that study that God basically hits me over the head with a spiritual 2x4. And I had this incredible experience of Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. And after that, I said, you know what? I don't want to go to these Protestant bookstores. I want to learn about my Catholic faith, So we went, I got a ton of books, and it's kind of funny, how looking back, God's hand, we're at this Catholic bookstore. I'm maxing out my Discover card, and Susan's with me. And she's never stepped foot in a Catholic bookstore. She was very, very anti-Catholic. And she said, hey, why don't you get this book? And it was Karl Keating's Catholicism and Fundamentalism.
Okay.
And she misread the title. She thought this was defending fundamentalism against Catholicism, because she's always been in Protestant bookstores. She just, that's the type of thing you see on the shelf. So I said, yeah, throw it on. And when I read it, Dustin, it was like, wow, there are historical, biblical, rational reasons for everything we believe. Mm-hmm. And wrote to Karl Keating. I said, hey, I think I want to start a ministry like yours. Catholic Answers was just kind of, they started publishing their magazine, so they've been around for a little while.
Yeah.
And so I formed my own 401c3 corp for a while, nonprofit. We ran it for 5 or 6 years, and then eventually I had to close the doors. But since then, I've still engaged in apologetics. I focus mostly on writing books, doing talks.
Mm-hmm.
So I have several books I've written on apologetics, like Revolt Against Reality. Here's a cheap plug for the new book.
Yeah.
Hostile Witnesses, how the enemies of the church prove Catholicism, Making Sense of Mary, other books as well. Oh, and Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. So let's see. That takes me to basically where we are today, where Terry Barber asked and Jesse Romero asked me to do a host for a Catholic Apologetics program on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. So I do that from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern on Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And also I have my own YouTube channel I do with William Albrëcht called the Apocrypha Apocalypse.
Right.
Where, the Old Testament canon has been kind of an obsession with me for a number of years. So it's just a way for me to get content out, get it out of my system. And of course, William has some great videos too. So
he sure does. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've been rocking and rolling on it, and that pretty much covers everything, I think.
I think so. Yeah, you guys make an awesome duo. So I'm glad that
Thanks.
you're that we're working together. So yeah, tell me. Okay, first of all, this book it's not entirely divorced from apologetics, because in apologetics we do deal with questions of ultimate reality and sin and rebellion and that kind of a thing. But this isn't primarily an apologetics work. So I'm curious, what inspired you to write Revolt Against Reality in the first place? How did this whole project sort of come about?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a hybrid, apologetics, history, ultimate questions. Sir Arnold Lund wrote a couple of books in this kind of genre, in Flight from Reason and Revolt Against Reason, where he traces the intellectual aftermath of the Protestant Revolution to Victorianism and scientism and rationalism. So this goes from the beginning of human creation to basically today. Why I wrote it? Well, because things are crazy.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
And the funny thing is, Dustin, there's been a number of books I've read over the years that have given little pieces of the puzzle as to how things are so crazy today, even though that wasn't their main reason for writing it. But these books were so scholarly and pedantic that practically no one read them, which is a shame, because they're gold, and these are really well-researched books. So I thought, somebody needs to put these books in popular form and stitch them together and give an explanation, a possible explanation as to how we got into the sanity we're in today. And then, as we were talking before the show, originally I was going to start with the incarnation. And then I thought, there's an even earlier revolt, which is the serpent's lie in the garden. So I basically trace these deep causes of today's insanity back through history to the beginning in the garden. And that was, and I should probably note this too, because I think it's important in understanding my book, is what I did was I started with the world as it was when I finished my manuscript, which was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And then I tried to take the immediate causes of what we were experiencing and trace it backwards through history. And by doing that, I kind of back engineered the causal chain, because one of the things I didn't want to do was make a conspiracy theory.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and conspiracy theories thrive on the single cause fallacy, because whenever there's an event, there's always multiple causes.
Sure.
So by back engineering it, what I did was I picked out single causes that had the longest duration and effect for today. So that enabled me to write, I think, a readable book that's fairly short, that covers all this history, so you can kind of see how these revolts against the incarnation kind of spread and open up doors to further revolts until finally we get to the insanity today. So that's that's my long explanation. But I think it's helpful, though,
Perfect.
at
Yeah.
least if you want to understand how the book was put together and what we're looking at.
Yeah. So before we talk about sort of factors or phenomena of insanity, when we talk about, okay, so how are things supposed to be? This is based upon the blueprint for creation, and also you can't separate that from the incarnation. So, I guess my first question is, um, what went wrong? Like, how was it in the beginning before the serpent enters the picture? What are some takeaways that we can garner about human existence, the nature of reality, our relationship to the Creator, and so on? What's the sort of blueprint that we're supposed to, get focused on?
Right. Yeah. So my first chapters in the beginning was Sanity. And, and basically what it is it starts with creation. God is goodness itself. And through his wisdom, his word, he creates all things, visible and invisible. And so there's this correspondence between what God is and what he creates. And so it's an analogous um, correspondence, right?
Right.
Because we, in a finite way, limited way, kind of reflect the wisdom of God. All
Right.
things reflect the God's wisdom.
Yeah.
So there's that combination, and of course, God creates not just in a haphazard way, but Genesis is very specific about that. This is all done within a particular order, particular time. There's a hierarchy of being. Um, and one thing it emphasizes is that God creates things according to their kind. Okay.
Right.
So in other words, he gives things essences or natures that have certain capabilities to do things and certain incapabilities of doing other things.
Right.
So there's a directedness built into creation at the very beginning. And what I do is I kind of tease out all these details in Genesis, and ultimately that sets the stage for the first insane act of human history, namely Adam's fall.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. Sin entering the picture via the temptation of the serpent. What does the serpent do to sort of distort the picture of reality as God has intended it? How did he present it to Adam and Eve? What did they fall for? What did they buy into that was a lie?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you look at what the serpent says, he basically says, that God really isn't looking out for your best interest. God is good, but God has ulterior motives. So the serpent's kind of stepping in and giving secret information, secret knowledge about
Mhm.
what's really going on behind the scenes that Eve was unaware of. And he basically says that God knows that if you eat of this fruit, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And I think within this context, knowing good and evil has the sense of determining for yourself what is good and what is evil.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a kind of divine deception going on, according to the lie, that God's holding out on you. Really, God arbitrarily chooses what's good and what's bad. It's not
Yeah.
locked into his goodness.
Right.
And so he says, no, if you do this rebellion, you eat the fruit, then you can be your own master. You can determine what's good and what's evil. And unfortunately, Eve buys the lie, and so does Adam. And that's the first real act of insanity, because I define sanity as to degree to which what we know corresponds to what is.
Right. Reality.
So when they buy the lie, it just severs that connection between what is known and what truly is.
Yeah, and that, I guess, insanity would be synonymous with sin, right?
Yeah.
Disorder.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Disorder. Where order is reality.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So that just kind of tears apart all these things that God joined in creation originally, and it introduces all sorts of things. For example, there's a kind of infidelity that goes on in the fall. because in a sense, if you follow the narrative alone, you notice that God gives the command not to eat of the fruit to Adam alone. He never repeats it for Eve.
Right.
So the early church fathers always assumed that Eve learns the commandment through Adam. So Adam is kind of like a type of the church, right? Where we learn God's revelation through the church.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a kind of seduction that's going on with the serpent's lie, where Eve has to decide whether to remain faithful to her spouse and go along with the law of God, both God and her spouse, or to believe this lie, So there's that fracture between that natural marriage of Adam and Eve. There's also, like I said, that introduction of secret knowledge, and also that God can deceive us. He can make things a certain way, but really things can be totally different just because he wills them to be so. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And so running through all these sort of phenomena of insanity that run their course throughout history and bring us to where we are today, I guess the common element is it all goes back to the garden, as we were talking about, right? Yeah. It's not like so many of the church fathers repeat, God became man so that man could become God, or gods by grace, by participation in divine life, of course. That's not what's condemned in Genesis. What's condemned is thinking that you could be God on your own terms, apart from God.
Yeah.
And sort of we get to be the masters of our own destiny. We get to dictate what is real and what is not, what is true and what is false. And that kind of sets the stage for everything else that unfolds throughout your book, right?
Yeah. And today, where people can identify as an animal, a panda, a man can identify as a woman. I mean, all that craziness today, that's all implicit right there in the lie.
Yeah.
And through all these revolts throughout history too. That's why I try to do in my book is kind of make these threads that you can see the continuity of these mistakes.
Yeah. So you identify several major players or events or phenomena that are these markers of insanity or revolt or rebellion. So why don't we talk about some of that? We've already talked about the beginning, the first revolt. Where do you go sort of in chronological order throughout the book? How do you sort of map this out?
Yeah, so there's some very important things that happen between the fall, of course, and the incarnation. We drop like a stone. I mean, Adam's first offspring is fratricide. He kills his brother. And so what you have in the Old Testament is God stooping down to our barbaric level to reintroduce certain principles and ideas and institutions so that slowly, his people that he has separate from the nations can get ready for his definitive revelation in Christ. So I do a really quick apology with that. Actually, we answer some typical atheist objections about things like that, like whether God commanded genocide, things like that. And then, and of course, I'm the deuterocanonical dude, right? So I have to have something with the Deuterocanon, but this is a really important juncture in salvation history, and it's recorded within the deuterocanonical books. And it's the Jews encounter Greek philosophy.
Right.
Before Jesus comes on the scene.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there, brother. But I just wanted to interject here because I like that you show sort of the marriage between the two, because so many scholars and lay people actually drive an absolute dichotomy or wedge between the God of the Greeks and the God of the Jews, or the God of the Bible and the God of the philosophers, and say that they're mutually exclusive. But that's not true at all.
No, not at all. In fact, it's interesting. I had an email from a Jewish person in England, and he wanted to ask some questions about the faith. And he said, about this, God becoming man thing, the Trinity. You guys, that's all pagan. I mean, that's nothing like Judaism. And I responded, well, yeah, it's nothing like rabbinic Judaism, but
correct.
If you had these books that we have, these older Jewish books, you would find that there is this incredible development, because when the Jews come in contact with Greek philosophy, there's a kind of mutual enlightenment that goes on.
Yeah.
where the Jews can now explain and dive deeper into the mysteries of the Bible using some elements of Greek thought. And also they can kind of purify Greek thought. So it
Right.
lights up like Christmas tree lights. So the Jews right before the time of Christ had this idea that God's wisdom is distinct with God, it's with God, and is God, but it's not identical with God, you know.
Right.
And so you kind of have in seed form this Jewish thoughts about, you know, God's spirit, God's wisdom, and the relationship of how they're there. So when Christ comes on the scene, you know, John can write his prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he's doing nothing but just taking this development in later Jewish thought and using it to explain the incarnation. And so it's
Yeah.
very Jewish.
Oh, for sure.
But there's that complementarity though of of reason
Yeah.
and revelation that just
Right.
go together. Yeah.
Yeah. All somebody would have to do would read the works of Philo. I mean, it's no more
Yeah.
evident in there than that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And two, if people went back far enough into, you know, the ancient Jewish faith of the Jerusalem temple, which is what I, you know, kind of deal with in my podcast, they would show that these concepts are not foreign by any means, but are the very lifeblood of the Israelite faith. So it just depends on how far you want to go back.
Yeah. You can see it in seed form, you know,
Right.
some ideas there. And then it just comes. And then once God providentially does this, you know, not only do you have in Sirach and Wisdom and Baruch, and like you said with Philo, even this development of thought, but you know, you also have everybody speaks the same language. You know, Greek, the lingua franca,
Yeah.
Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek with the Greek Septuagint. So now it's like now the nations can now have access to God's revelation and all of this. And then the Romans come and you have the Roman network system, right?
Right.
So when Christ comes on the scene, not only are the Jews prepared for this revelation, but things are set up for the gospel to just explode throughout the ancient world.
True. Yeah. Yeah. So, so what is so we know what happens to humanity when we fall, but what does the incarnation show us about what it means to be truly human? How does that reorient us to get us to our destiny and our calling again as being true human beings? Because as Saint Irenaeus, who is, I don't know if the Holy Father has declared him a doctor of the church yet, or is going to, and very soon. Yeah. Saint Irenaeus said the glory of God is man fully alive. So to be truly divinized or deified is to be truly human, and Christ is the true human par excellence. So how does the incarnation reorient our humanness?
Yeah, this is the pivotal moment in all of human history, because what happens in the incarnation is this magnificent unity that occurs in history, where the invisible God becomes visible, the infinite God is united to the finite, the immaterial is united with the material. And not only are all these things put together in the incarnation, but we are united to God through our union with Christ, and through our union with Christ, we're united radically to each other as his body. And so there's this great unifying moment in human history where, Dustin, you and I are closer than siblings because we both have Eucharistic DNA flowing through our bloodstreams. We are members of Christ's body. And that just sets off all these radical revolutions of thought that just transforms the Christian East and Christian West, or, the pagan East, pagan West becomes Christian.
Yeah.
And, in my book, I love the works of Michael Aquilina. I mean, he's has a number of books. So I kind of steal little bits and pieces from Mike. So, and I show how, this idea of this unifying moment just transforms human society, right? Because now by loving our neighbor as ourselves, we are doing worship, right? It's salvific,
right?
Redemptive suffering. Suffering is transformed, death is transformed. This idea of people being fated to certain things, like in pagan understanding that,
Yeah.
it's just we're on this cyclical time that just keeps going around and around, and you can't break the cycle. The incarnation, the resurrection, snaps that, and it kind of shows us that, our actions do have eternal consequences. And so there's revolutions of thought that spin off from that. In my book, I show how, marriages transform. All those things that were destroyed, or I shouldn't say destroyed, they were damaged in the fall, are made whole in Christ. And when they're made whole in Christ, huge vistas of light come out where, we have the beginnings of modern science that comes from this revelation. You have reordering of society. I could just go on and on and on. So just buy all of Mike Aquilina's books. You can see how, or get mine for a summary. But
yeah, Mike's definitely great. Yeah, he does a lot of awesome work. Mike does.
Yeah.
So what are some other players that you identify in your book, and how do they kind of distort God's plan, God's vision for creation and humanity?
Yeah, well, almost immediately you have humanity kind of shrinks back from the blinding light of the incarnation. And so there are groups that attack Christ's true humanity, like the Docetists, the Gnostics, and so on. You have groups that kind of downgrade Christ's divinity, like Arians and Monothelites and stuff like that. So you have these attacks on the incarnation, trying to come up with another way that you could unify, apart from the incarnation. And again, each one of these revolts kind of echo throughout history. Gnosticism, and again, Gnosticism, it's what is salvation is through secret knowledge. Yeah. And there's also this idea of like desacramentalization of the church, right? Because the Gnostics believed matter was evil. So
yes,
that changes your view on procreation. That changes your view on, the church as an invisible society of the knowing ones, as opposed to the rank and file. So I go through that, and what I show is that ultimately, these groups end up in the deserts, with monastic orders.
Yeah.
So, Christian charity goes to scale with the monastics, right? The monasteries become proto-hospitals. They become centers of learning. And then you have the hermits. And sometimes some less than orthodox hermits would dwell in the desert. And then that's where Islam comes on the scene. So I think one of the major junctions in the revolt against reality is what happens with Islam. And this is really fascinating, Dustin, because Islam encounters Greek philosophy, kind of like the Jews did before Christ, right? They start rediscovering Aristotle. And unlike the Jews, that there's this kind of marriage, it's a train wreck, because Islamic revelation can't really square with, rational thought, right?
Yeah.
So
there is some big debates in early Islam about that, and it was the philosophers who were anathematized.
Yeah.
But you have people like Ibn Sina, who Saint Thomas Aquinas loved to quote. But so you had these little sparks, or these little lights of where it could kind of work, but overwhelmingly the majority that didn't take, like in the Jewish Christian milieu.
If I call them, for simplification, the rational party and the irrational party. The Asherites and the Montazelites, I think, is how they pronounce it.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm back engineering, so there's a lot more, to Islam than just these two parties. But
for sure. But for simplification purposes, right.
And so, so if you look at the rational party, it really does almost mirror a little bit like Christianity. That you should understand the Quran in terms of its historical context, that you can use reason to know good and evil, things like that. But it kind of downgrades Islamic revelation. And there were some things in that group that simply wouldn't fit, Islamic orthodoxy.
Right.
So they really were heretics. On the other hand, you have the traditional party or the irrational party, who basically posits something like that Allah's will is not constrained by his nature, that Allah can will whatever he wants. Okay, so he can call one thing good, and then later he could call it bad.
Mm-hmm.
He can change his mind. It's not really the thing in itself. It's not the nature of a thing that determines its goodness or badness, but it's Allah's will. Okay?
Yes. Yeah.
And again, that sounds a lot like that lie in the garden, right? It's because God determines good and evil, and you could do the same. And of course, this takes on a particular shape because what happens is Islam then, the only way to know Allah's will is through his revelation alone, not through reason.
Correct.
And it also means that you learn it through the clerics who can interpret, the Quran. Yeah. So it's not like you can look at nature and see what's good and bad and try to understand the Quran in light of that. And there's all sorts of other things that go into the book, but that's the basic seed. And in reaction to that, you have Abrëcht, right, who basically tries to separate the two of revelation and reason, and basically say, well, the philosopher rulers will be guided by reason, and revelation is just for the plebs, the people that don't really know much.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So he kind of divides faith and reason. So that brings us to Europe, and I don't know how much detail you want to go into.
Hey, brother, it's your thing. You go into as much detail as you'd like, and I'm all ears. I'm loving this stuff. So
yeah, I find it so fascinating that I just go on and on and on and on. So
same here. Yeah.
Yeah. Stop me if I'm going way too much into
Will do.
And I'm glad we have several hours so we can be here to go through.
Yeah. Right. We got nothing else to do.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Buy the book. Buy the book. But basically, what happens. And I go into the back history of how this happens, that because of the collapse of the Roman Empire, the church kind of fills in some, what do I want to say, temporal duties, okay? And this opens the church up to lots of dangers and corruption. And anyway, this really important event happens in Christian history where the emperor is being elected. And it's being elected during an interregnum period. Mm-hmm. So basically, the Pope was the one who was supposed to basically anoint the emperor, right?
Right.
And it's between Ludwig of Bavaria and Frederick the Fair. The various houses were split. Both of them were, one party elected Ludwig, the other party elected Frederick. And there's no pope to decide between the two. So they start warring against each other. Then Pope John the 22nd comes on the scene. And basically he says, I want both of you to abdicate, lay down your weapons, and we'll have a new election. And both of them basically say, no way, Ludwig wins the battle ultimately. And he's excommunicated by the Pope. So this opens like a warfare between the emperor and the Pope. And Ludwig basically does the scorched earth policy. He goes after the Pope both with the sword and also with the pen. Okay. The sword, he actually has troops, and he gets inaugurated emperor, in Rome under force. And also he enlists a couple of intellectuals to help undermine the authority of the Pope. Okay. And two of those is Marcella of Padua, who basically follows like Abrëcht's understanding. He proposes that a just society should be founded on reason, and then religion just kind of confirms what the government, whatever it says.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other one's William of Ockham. And William of Ockham's story is fascinating. He was a Franciscan. He was brought to trial in Avignon because this is during the Avignon papacy, and the poor Franciscans were on trial there. The poor Franciscans are called poor because they believed that absolute poverty was perfectly in line with the gospel, like radical poverty. And so they enlisted William of Ockham to argue their case, in front of the Pope.
Okay.
And the papal claim and the Christian claim would be that's not true, because the Old Testament, God legislated goods, property. It's a good thing.
Right.
And also, Jesus had a money purse. There were a couple of swords. So, there's no such thing as this absolute poverty. So William Occam's solution is essentially that God's will is not constrained by his nature.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So God could say that property was good in the Old Testament, and then in the New, he could say it's bad, right? And so anyway, he flees the court into the loving arms of William of Bavaria, who protects him. And he starts what's known as Ockhamism, this whole idea of detaching God's nature from his will. It's called voluntarism.
Right.
And the mess begins, right? Because his Ockhamism becomes the standard philosophy within the universities eventually.
Okay.
Which is it was called the Via Moderna, the modern way.
The modern way. What is Occam's razor, by the way?
Oh, it's just basically that the shortest and simplest explanation is usually the true one.
I see.
Yeah. So there's a lot to go in. I'd go into the book, but basically, it becomes the modern way, which is kind of funny. We are familiar with modernism. This was modernism back in the 1300s, and it enters the university system, and what happens is it's called nominalism. Okay. In other words, what William Occam said, it really doesn't matter what your nature is, what your essence is, how that doesn't matter. What matters is the name that you put on it. Okay. So God kind of sticks names. So he says this is good, this is bad.
It's arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole idea is because we don't want to constrain God's will by his nature, which is kind of funny because I don't know how an infinite nature can be constrained. It has, by definition, no limits.
Right.
So anyway, so that's when Martin Luther comes on the scene. He is in the university system. He's a thoroughgoing nominalist, although he did have some problems with certain aspects of nominalism. And once you take that philosophy and you put it into Christian theology, you end up with Protestantism. So think about justification by faith alone, for example.
Yeah.
How are we justified? Well, we are condemned, damnable sinners. God legally declares us to be righteous, but we don't change. We're still damnable sinners, right?
Yeah. What's changed is the extrinsic kind of, it's basically naming us righteous without actually making us so.
Yeah, exactly. Nominalism. Right? Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I go through, there's all sorts of, once you inject that into Christian thought, you just start tearing apart, these things that were united within the incarnation. And what happens in Protestantism, it begins to take a particular anti-incarnational form. With Calvin's Zwingli, you start having the, rejection of sacramentals, sacraments, the outward materiality of worship disappears. And they want to have this unmediated connection between my soul, my interior being, and God without any material, intervention or human intervention.
Right.
So the priesthood's gone, the mass is gone as a sacrifice. And in a sense, I mean, you kind of see shades of Gnosticism in this, right?
Yeah, right.
So it's no longer what matters is that God saves me, body and soul. What matters is saving my soul. My body remains sinful, condemnable.
Yep. That's Gnosticism repackaged.
Yeah, essentially. And of course, I'm oversimplifying, but like I said, we don't have 8 or 9 hours to get into.
Right.
Yeah. So what happens is immediately it starts fracturing, and that's another aspect of nominalism. It atomizes everything it touches. It breaks into individual parts because Occam denied universals. These things that unite things like humanity, right?
Right.
You can't go to the store and buy 10 pounds of humanity. Humanity is just something our minds see that's really features in the world that we can group certain disparate things and say, this is humanity, right?
Right.
So what happens is Protestantism just begins to fracture like crazy. And there's a book, and I always forget the title, and it's something like this. It was only like maybe 3 or 4 decades after Luther. It's called 200 Different Interpretations of This Is My Body.
200?
Yeah, I think it was 200 or 250.
Oh my goodness.
I remember correctly. Yeah, so Protestantism just fractures and it just individuates, right? And yeah, I should mention this too. That's part and parcel of Luther's revolt. And in my book, I actually got this from a Lutheran book, The Churches That Luther Left Behind. It was very pro-Luther, but he had a very interesting insight. Protestant identity is made up of 2 facets that comes from Luther. The first one is the righteous rebel. Okay. What's the most famous line from Luther, even though it's apocryphal, is, here I stand, I could do no other, right? Yeah. Diet of worms.
Right.
So that I can rebel against the historic church. I can rebel against anyone as long as my cause is righteous. Right.
Yeah, my conscience is clear. Yeah.
Exactly. The other part of Protestant identity is doctrinal purity. That the cause of being the righteous rebel can be doctrinal purity. So Luther rejected the historic church because he believed certain aspects were not biblical. They weren't pure. But what happens is once you accept those 2 principles, then somebody who follows Luther could say, well, I can separate myself from Luther. Yeah. Why? Because, my cause is just because he's not pure enough. Right.
Right.
And
based on his own principles, somebody could justify that.
Exactly. So it's part of the DNA of the Protestant revolt is this constant splintering. And since at this time, church and state are very much united, distinct, but nevertheless they're kind of interconnected. This erupts in religious wars throughout Europe. Catholics against Protestants, Protestants against Protestants, radical Reformation against magisterial Reformation. It turns into a war zone, Christian Europe. And so that leads to people trying to fix the problem. Okay. Right. Instead of going back to the incarnation, that ultimate uniting event, they try to do it on their own. And so what you have is, for example, deism, I believe, is one of those attempts that, well, we're arguing about propositions. Why don't we just lower the number of propositions so everybody can sign on, not just Christians, but anybody, right? And of course, that falls down to, God becomes kind of the guy who winds up creation and lets it go. And
the watchmaker.
There's no public revelation. There's all sorts of really bad, leaves a bad aftertaste. It doesn't unite everybody. It just adds yet another group, right?
Right.
And it also undermines the confidence in revelation. You have also this kind of consumerism that comes out of the Dutch Republic that, we can disagree on religious things, but we all want the goodies. We want the imports, the trade, the things like that. That tries to unify people. And so here you have Christians who used to be, very frugal in terms of, their goods and becoming rich and things like that. Now you kind of have consumerism starting. It's just like one bad idea after another.
Yeah, they just keep rolling out.
Yeah, and each one causes another problem that they try to fix, which causes another problem. And so I trace that into, eventually one unifying idea that came about. Really, John Locke is probably the most well-known of this group, would be to create religion, okay? Up until this point in the 1700s, religion was just a virtue. It was a duty that you needed to do.
Yeah.
So voting was religion.
I see.
Going to the temple was religion, So Locke and the Enlightenment comes up with this idea of, why don't we make a little play space, a safe place for, the religious people.
This is Lockean then.
Yeah. So the interior beliefs, about the Trinity and that, you can go and hold whatever you want in the religious area, but that's separate from secular the state, which is concerned about property and life and liberty and goods and services and property.
Yeah. So the
Yeah, so
privatization of religion, this is where this kind of takes off.
yeah, exactly. And really what it is, it was that separation was really an encroachment of the state upon the church, right? Because the church always functioned or tried to function as a capping authority for the state. Rulers couldn't do whatever they wanted with their citizens. There was a higher law, and and the Pope and bishops could punish temporal rulers to some extent. But when you separate them, now there's no capping authority for the state. And it also causes all sorts of problems because all the things Locke lists, or most of them, are really religious as well as secular. I mean, life. I mean, we're living that right now. Who determines what life is? Who determines when life begins? Who determines what's the value of human life? Is it human life sacred and viable under all conditions, or is it about people who maybe are defective in the sense they have handicaps, or they're ill, or they're old? These are philosophical religious questions. They're not questions, strictly speaking, secular.
Right, but the state has kind of taken over the role of determining them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so then you have that going, of this thing. And also the other thing too, notice that Locke builds upon the edifice that was started with the Protestant Revolt, in that, the Protestant Revolt was kind of like ultimately turns religion into an interior spiritual matter of my soul with my creator. And so Locke just kind of builds on that. He says, okay, well, the interior stuff you keep in your synagogues and churches and whatever, but the exterior stuff, that's what the state's concerned about. So it's, and this is just one thread among many that, I follow in my book, where you could just see where the door is open, it gets wider, there's problems, they try to fix the problems, and it just makes even more problems.
So I'm curious because the whole Descartesian, there's a separation from the soul and the body, but also the sort of idea of the universe as mechanical. It kind of runs on its own according to its own principles, and then God is totally separate from that process.
Yeah, much like the serpent's lie in the beginning, right? It's just arbitrary will of God that determines good and evil, not the natures of things.
So what are some of the, and all you have to do is probably, go on social media or watch the news, but speaking in contemporary terms, what are some of the biggest errors of today that we're having to deal with here?
Yeah, well, okay, so this is a spoiler alert. So if anybody's going to get the book, just beware. But I've said this on other interviews. I have a really weird take on Vatican II.
Okay.
That I haven't seen anywhere, but I think makes sense. And actually, it starts before Vatican II, but Vatican II is kind of the concrete manifestation of this. We used to joke about this when I first started Apologetics. The one thing that unites all Protestants is their opposition to the Pope, opposition to Catholicism. That's the only thing that unites all of them. And so, and you have that Protestant identity, the righteous rebel, doctrinal purity, right?
Yeah.
And I think what happens is that Vatican II comes on the scene, and Pope Paul VI was not an imperial pope, right? He was not John the 22nd, and Vatican II was not your typical council. It didn't have anathemas. It was promoting ecumenism. It was very pastoral, right? And what I think this did inadvertently was kind of kick the chair out of under Protestant identity that was already eroding, since the 1800s. And suddenly the righteous rebel is without a cause, in the 60s, because, this isn't the imperial evil church, right? This is a puppy. So what happened, I think, is, especially in America, because remember, we didn't, and Canada, I think Canada as well. We didn't undergo a Catholic period and then became Protestant like Europe did.
Right.
We started out, I mean, there were Spanish and so on, but really American society is Protestant at the beginning. Right?
Sure.
So it really affects us much less than in Europe and other places. But what I think happens is that Protestant identity, the rebels without a cause. So what happens is you still have the righteous rebel, right?
Mm.
That I can stand up against anyone and anything as long as my cause is just. Except now it's no longer doctrinal purity, but it becomes social purity. And you really start seeing this in the late 1960s, early 70s, where people are no longer saying, I'm a Baptist, I'm a Lutheran. What they're saying is, I'm, against segregation, I'm against the war. You have this tribalism kind of erupting.
Yeah.
So now, and just like how in religion, those two things, the righteous rebel and doctrinal purity, rip apart Protestantism. Well, once that's transferred to the secular sphere, it rips apart society, right? And that's kind of where we are today. Is everything gets lowered down to individuals. And you have this voluntaristic understanding that the court can determine whether a baby, is human or not, whether you lose their life or not. Gender identity. I mean, all that stuff makes sense because it's like you can see where the train was headed.
Yeah. Now the rebel without a cause theme has shifted from religion to just aspects of secular society, and these are how the camps are established, the tribes are established, and we're all at war with each other.
Yeah, and it's their identity. And the thing is, once you fuse your cause with your identity, you can never admit defeat and you can never admit victory, because once you do, you're obsolete. And so what happens is we end up on this treadmill of going from one cause to another cause to another cause. I mean, you can see this all over the place. With gay marriage, once gay marriage was allowed, then it's the LBGT, and then or LBG, and then it just starts adding these letters, right? Because it's like one cause after another, because you can't admit victory or defeat. You always have to have this struggle going on, right? Because
otherwise you lose your identity, you lose your purpose, and you disappear.
Yeah, and unfortunately that's where we are today. I think a lot of people have this cause identity fusion, where I identify myself, who I am is pick whatever. It could be anything, any ideology or political stance. That's who you are. And so humanity becomes reduced, right? It's not what the goodness of humanity is no longer because of what we are as human beings united to Christ, and we could share in Christ's divinity. It's what we do, right? It's who we belong to, what party, what ideology. That determines my intrinsic value.
Your worth.
Yeah,
I had a William just came on and he said, Gary's the man. What a fantastic book. Loving my copy. Hey, William, hope you're doing well, brother. Thanks for tuning in.
All right. Yeah. So, I originally had the manuscript end there in chapter 13 with the Revolt Against Reality. And, Dustin, it was so dark and so bleak that I can't end on this note, right?
Right.
So I added another one. Now, this was a couple of years ago. I looked around at the landscape to see where reality starts pushing back. In fact, I call it a reality strikes back, a little hat tip to the Star Wars series.
Yeah.
Because, you can try to deny reality. You can try to sweep it under the rug, but you can't deny the real. There's just no other game in town, right?
Right.
So I listed a whole bunch of things in the last chapter where there are reasons to hope, that the reality is eventually, it will win. It will weather the storm because it is what it is. And what's really cool, Dustin, is, like I said, I finished the manuscript a couple of years ago. And what I found is that some of these things have actually gone even further and developed even more positive light. So that shows me, I must be pretty close to the truth on this, because it shows some predictive power and it also shows some explanatory power as well.
Yeah. What are some of those signs of hope that are coming to more fruition in the last couple of years?
Well, let me give you just one.
Okay.
I know Islam. Strange thing in Islam that a couple of years ago was happening was that in Saudi Arabia, especially, there's so many foreign workers because of the closing of the Muslim mind. My head tip to Robert Riley's book.
Yeah.
Because they adopted this kind of irrational philosophy, science becomes crippled, and so does production and so on. So they're lagging. So they have to import foreign workers in order to update and modernize Saudi Arabia.
That gap, yeah.
So there's actually a huge population of non-Muslim foreign workers that are in the country, in the heart of Islam, in a sense. Of course, it's Afghanistan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. But
yeah.
So what happened is there was rumors that the Saudi government was going to allow a Christian church to be built to accommodate the foreign workers. And it was kind of a rumor, and it seemed like it was going to happen. Anyway, fast forward a couple years to today. Recently, there's been a Saudi prince has proposed some radical changes in Islamic theology and government, where many of the hadiths will no longer be applicable in jurisprudence. Basically, Wahhabism will no longer be the controlling religious viewpoint.
Yeah, thank God.
Yeah. So it's like Islam is starting to modernize and, in a sense, open up to the West because of this influx of Christianity, right? And I recommend check it out. There's some really great sites out there that they've been chronicling, like what's going on in Saudi Arabia. So back then it was like this tiny little light of hope. Now, it seems like Islam doesn't want to be third world. It wants to be second or first world, right? Yeah. And to do that, it has to shed a lot of things that are very peculiar to Islamic revelation. So that'd be one. I give about 8 or 9 points.
Interesting. So has that church actually been built since?
I'm not sure. I think it has, but I haven't been able to find much. And I have a feeling that if they did build it, they wouldn't publicize it.
Mm-hmm. I'd be curious to know what type of church.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'll have to look at my book. Actually, on December 1st, 2018, Egyptian and other Arab media reported that for the first time a Coptic mass had been held in Saudi Arabia in the city of Riyadh.
Wow. So that was 2018.
Yep. Yeah.
All right. So, well, we're coming up on an hour. Why don't you give us one more? You said you listed about 8 or 9. Why don't you give us one more?
Boy, I there's so much here.
One that really, really resonates with you.
Yeah, well, that would be the real obscure stuff.
And that's okay.
There's this revolution that's occurring in Catholic education. I in chapter 13, when I go through the Revolt Against Reality, I show how the church kind of becomes affected by Protestant culture, and the spirit of Vatican II comes about. Again, it's this shape of nominalism where you go by revelation alone as seen through the experts, right?
Yeah.
So after Vatican II, you have these team of experts that are implementing the Council in America, and it's anti-incarnational. They get rid of pictures, statues, things like that.
Yeah, high honors. Yeah.
And also there's a revolution in Catholic education. There's the coup at Catholic University, and basically a lot of really big brick and mortar institutions, Catholic institutions, basically say we're just going to be good secular universities to have daily mass, essentially.
Yeah, that's what we're looking at today, pretty much.
Yeah. And so there was this giant coup, and which that made me angry. It was tough to tap that down in the book, because you think all these good Catholics, poor people, working people, sending money to build these institutions so they could send their kids to have a Catholic education,
only to lose their faith, right?
Yeah, and ultimately, it's co-opted, so they go broke, trying to support these Catholic institutions, and it ends up that the kid loses their faith, or even worse, goes against the church.
How's that for betrayal?
Yeah. So, but you know what? What's interesting is, with Pope St. John Paul II, he begins to kind of turn the tide back with the Ex Cordia Ecclesiae. And what's interesting is all the big Catholic universities just basically thumb their nose at the Pope, right? They're not going to implement it. And basically, he puts down that, Catholic universities should be Catholic. That's truth in advertising, right?
Yeah.
So, but what happens is Catholic parents begin to send their kids to smaller institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these smaller institutions that's 100% faithful to the church that just blossom out of nowhere, like Franciscan University of Steubenville, Christendom College. There's all these small colleges that become universities. And so you have this rebirth in Catholic education. And not only that, but you also have an interesting phenomenon of homeschooling, right?
Yeah.
Where now homeschoolers, they can, I actually teach for Homeschool Connection, so I'm part of this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Catholics can homeschool their kids if there's no good Catholic elementary, middle school, high school things, and they can get experts to go on, like Zoom, things like that.
Sure.
And have these experts educate their kids for them. So the funny thing is now, brick and mortar institutions are becoming a liability, and it's harder and harder for schools to stay in business, right? Because it's just too expensive with all the, all the overhead and everything.
Yeah.
Well, now you have really good Catholic homeschool education going on that isn't affected by that.
Right.
And so there's now a cooperation between homeschoolers, Catholic homeschoolers, and Catholic colleges that remain faithful, where, they're working in cooperation with one another. So, that's another thing that has, it's a gleam of hope, compared to where we were in the 60s and 70s.
Absolutely. And one viewer, I don't know if you know what this is referring to, Masson Mountain asked, what's the latest from the Newman Guide? Are you familiar with that? I'm not sure what that is.
No, I don't know what the Newman Guide is.
Oh, okay. I'm assuming it's something related to Catholic education, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. Well, hey, you'll have to share it with me, whoever it was.
Yeah, Masson Mountain, if you want to elaborate on that, I'm not, like I said, we're both not familiar with that. I'd like to know now. Now my curiosity's piqued.
Yeah.
So Gary, what, at the end of the day, so we've covered a lot of ground here. How do we get back to sanity? I mean, it goes without saying, we want everybody to be Catholic, but not just to become card-carrying members and have a bigger club. It's for a reason.
Yeah.
Because it touches the heart of who we are as human beings, right?
Yeah. Getting
back on the road to the blueprint of reality and the Creator's destiny for the universe and humankind.
Yeah. Well, it starts with the individual. Whatever station in life God put you, that we need to get back to those revelations, that those blinding insights of the incarnation, and start living out our Catholic faith in a very authentic way, and to try to shape society in light of that. Because, quite frankly, what's scary today is that you're having a systemic collapse in society. It's not just 1 or 2 points. It seems like it's multiple points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's because the city of man that we live in is built on a faulty foundation. It's not built on that great unifying aspect of the incarnation. And the incarnation is reality itself. It's the beachhead. I was going to call that chapter like D-Day for reality, with the incarnation. And ultimately, I mean, we're going to go through troubles and hardships, but we're going to be the only ones left standing because, like I said, Catholicism is rooted in reality because it's rooted in Christ. And so stick close to the Eucharist, practice this supernatural love, for our brothers and sisters and for those outside the church. And ultimately, reality is going to win out because there is no other alternative. Either it's real or it's imaginary. And we're starting to see how, a lot of things that we've been living with has been built on an imaginary foundation.
Yeah, foundation of sand for sure.
Yeah.
The mirage in the desert, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Brother Gary, I have enjoyed this hour immensely. It's gone by very quick, and I've learned so much. I cannot wait to get my hands on the physical copy of Revolt Against Reality. And
Awesome.
in case anybody's looking to purchase it, where can they go?
Yeah, just go to Catholic.com or shop.catholic.com. It's also available as Kindle, so you can go to Amazon if you want to buy through Amazon. That's probably the two best places to get it.
Wonderful. Well, I encourage everybody to go get a copy and share. And please like, share, and subscribe to all of Gary's channels. So you've got, you've got your personal website, GaryMichuta.com. You've got handsonapologetics.com, and your YouTube channel with William Albrëcht is Apocrypha Apocalypse. So everybody check that out if you've got an interest in the Deuterocanon. I know you said that's more niche, but still, yeah. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who would greatly benefit from that material. And I just can't thank you enough, Gary, and tell you what an honor, privilege, and a blessing it's been to have you on this evening. I so enjoyed our time together.
Yeah, I did too, and the honor's all mine. Like I said, I've been watching your channel for quite some time, and you have great guests, so I'm honored to be asked to be on the show.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll just close out the show. Guys, you've been watching Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this was episode number 55 with Gary Michuta, author of Revolt Against Reality. God bless, be safe, and everyone have a great evening, and we'll see you again soon. I'm going to end in 3, 2, 1.